We have, yes, international students among us too, so this is going to be in English. Welcome to the first of our series on debating the global politics. Okay, so shall I wait? This particular talk is organized by the Center for Modern Turkish Studies, and the reason why I called it the first in our series is that it is the first in our series in this particular semester. Otherwise, Muzaffer knows the number. We have had quite a few speakers under the same series, and the other series too, at least 10 probably, since we... 11, yeah, okay, 11 speakers so far. Today we have Professor Murat Somer, who is an associate professor in Koç University in Political Science and International Relations Department. He holds his PhD degree from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles in political economy. I didn't know you had a PhD in political economy. I thought it was in international relations. Professor Somer is a prolific researcher and writer, publishing in top-notch journals and numerous edited volumes. He publishes on, or he has rather published on, comparative politics, political economy and Turkish politics, ethnic conflicts and nationalism, religious and secular politics and political Islam. I only chose the most prominent topics, themes that we wrote on. With his research on religion and secular elites, he won a Sabancı Brookings International Research Award in 2009, and he was a Democracy and Development Fellow at Princeton University in the Institute for International Regional Studies, which is a very well-known, prestigious institute, in 2010 and 2011. Without much ado, I guess I should leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, Professor Giselle. And thank you very much for coming and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I hadn't been on this campus before, and it's very nice to learn a new campus and environment. I want to talk on the subject that has kept me busy in the last 3-4 years, and I think is very relevant for Turkey as well as the rest of the Muslim world, especially the emerging new polities in the post-Arab Spring countries such as Egypt and Tunisia. I don't want to keep my remarks very long, so I won't be able to elaborate on every point. I want to make some theoretical points as well, and I may not be able to elaborate on them as much as I would like to. For the details, what I will talk on today are actually in these two writings. And for those of you who are interested, then you can refer to them. So I have the main question, my main concern is in this research is what do we learn from the Turkish case, analyzing the Turkish experience of democratization since the 1920s. What do we learn from this case regarding democratization in Muslim countries? In order to do that, of course, we need to analyze the Turkish case from a theoretically informed perspective. And thinking of the Turkish case, I think looking at the research, we realize that just if we go back a little bit, we'll see that until the 1990s, especially in the Western world, the main perception was, and the writing reflected that, mainly the secular political actors were the country's Democrats. They were spearheading, Turkey's Western ambitions, as well as they were thought as the democratic actors in the country. So, as we all, I'm sure, know very well, then during the 1990s, the political Islamism went through some transformation and was one of the most dynamic political movements, political forces in the country. And as a result of that, the Justice and Development Party came to power in 2002. Now, when we look at the writing in the 2000s, then we see that predominantly the religious political actors, and most importantly the Justice and Development Party, is portrayed or seen as Democrats. Now, that is, I think, is a positive, is a challenge for us from a theoretical perspective as well, because our theoretical approach should not be so much sensitive to political changes. So we should have, you can't just change your theory and how you analyze issues based on the political changes that are occurring. And I would say that actually neither view is correct. First of all, I think we need to question, as I will do later, we need to think more carefully about what democratization actually is. Our conception of democratization. How do we conceptualize democratization? But and in addition, both views earlier are preoccupied with the identity and ideology of political actors. Are they secular? Are they religious? What is their ideology? What is their political identity? And as a result, who the actors are, becomes more important than the mainstream ideas, norms, and institutions that affect all political actors in the country. So rather than looking at the political system, rather than looking at the institutions, rather than the norms of behavior, the ideas, then we are focusing on the identity, or political identity of the actors in question. And in these studies, I'm sure those of you who work on this are familiar with this. The concept of political moderation is a major theoretical construct to explain democratization. And accordingly, then it is argued that the political Islamism in Turkey moderated during the 1990s and became a democratic actor. And that is one important reason why they are viewed as the Democrats more recently. But is really moderation per se a meaningful concept, independent from each country's specific context? It's a very slippery concept. What is it really? It's usually conceptualized as some kind of an adjustment, as some kind of a compromise with something, but it is never sufficiently specified compromise with what, or adjustment to what. And as a result, it is never clarified what it exactly is and when it would produce democratization, when we would predict or expect it to contribute to democratization. So then I argue that, first of all, in most of these studies, of course, the main subject of study is political Islamism. You know, we're studying moderation of the political Islamism or lack of moderation of the political Islamism. But we cannot expect this from political Islamists alone. This is not the only thing that we should study. It is an interactive process between religious and secular actors. Their moderation or whatever it is, their actions affect the others and vice versa. It is an interactive process, so its consequences would also depend on these interactions. And I argue also that to offer a better, in an attempt to offer a better definition, then I argue that moderation involves an adjustment to a country's center. And there is, we are familiar with the concept of center coming from Sherif Mardin in Turkey, but that is not the one that I'm using here. I define it differently, although in terms of the term, certainly I was inspired by him and Schill's, other people who have actually used this term. But I define it differently, so I won't be able to go into detail here in the interest of time. But basically I'm talking about here the mainstream domestic and international context of a country. So the values, interests, and norms, norms of behavior, the values, interests, and norms of behavior that comprise the centers vary widely across countries. So since the center in each country is different, then what we call moderation will also be very different, will look very different in every country, because the center is actually very different. What they are adjusting to is something very different. So, and then what can we say in terms of democratization? What can we say about when we can expect moderation to produce democratization? So I think we have to distinguish between especially two types of countries. We can think of countries that have a democratic center. If a country has a democratic center, then I think we can much more easily and readily associate moderation with democratization. The models can be seen as democrats, and they can be expected to further democratization. An example could be United States during the 1950s, before the civil rights movement. Now think of the United States at that time. It has a very liberal democratic constitution. Since the second half of the 19th century, in all the democracy indices, in fact, the United States was classified as a democracy, in fact, as a full democracy. Of course, these indices are not perfect. You know, we can be critical of these indices, but just putting that question aside, whatever they are measuring, we can argue that the United States had a democratic center. There were strongly democratic norms and institutions in the country. However, it does not mean that a country that has a democratic center is or does not need democratization, cannot further democratize. In the case of the United States, even though the center was democratic, the norms, principles of the center were not equally applied to all the segments, all the regions of the country. And most importantly, that as we all know, the especially racial minorities were not benefiting equally from the principles that were already existing. They were not benefiting equally from the rights and freedoms that were, in fact, part of this center. So, in that case, the challenge was to apply the values, interests, norms of behavior of the center equally to the disenfranchised segments of the American society. And that, I think, that, as we all know, occurred with the civil rights movement. When some actors in the majority society moderated and became open to applying these standards to racial minorities, and also within the racial minorities there emerged some actors who wanted to cooperate with the center to reach some kind of a compromise. So in that kind of framework, we can expect that moderation can be expected to help democratization. So the challenge is actually find actors who will compromise and who will come together so that they will expand the rights and freedoms to more regions and to more segments of society. But the challenge is different, fundamentally different, in countries with semi-democratic or authoritarian centers. So in the Turkish case, so many post-Arab Spring countries can be considered countries with authoritarian centers. In the Turkish case, we can define Turkey as a country with a semi-democratic center. In those cases, moderation, rather than furthering democratization, may also involve adoption, retention, and reproduction of the center's undemocratic attributes. So, so the challenge is actually, I will say more on this at the end of my presentation. So in this case, and the challenge is different. The challenge is actually to build a democratic center. As Turkey should do, and also that like the new polities of the Middle East need to do. There are some empirical issues that I will now not spend much time to right now, but if there are questions, then I will be happy to discuss with you. I use a different methodology to measure the values of the religious and secular actors in Turkey in response to these empirical problems. But for now, in order not to distract you, I will not say much on this. But so, how can we analyze the Turkish case of democratization from this perspective? And actually, I develop this perspective also by looking at the Turkish case in different periods of the Turkish case within case comparative framework. Okay, so when we look at the Turkish case, the foundation period of the Turkish case, with the foundation of the Republic, and the period approximately from the 1920, the establishment of the first national parliament during the War of Independence, until the end of the Second World War. This is basically the emergence of a secularist political center. During this period, at the beginning of this period, we learned more and more that there were two types of elites, and both are products of the late Ottoman modernization. During the late Ottoman modernization, as many people have analyzed and argued, two types of elite responses emerged to the challenges of modernization and rescuing the Ottoman state. One, secularist type of elites who basically wanted to westernize the country and establish secular Western institutions. And there were also Islamist modernizers. They were also interested in modernization, but their model, at least partially, also came from Islam and Islamism. They were inspired by them. But during this foundational period, the institutions of the center were basically unilaterally founded by the secularist elites. At that time, the Islamist modernizers, they were basically sidelined. And the ruling Republican People's Party unilaterally made all these secular reforms. So we can portray this as a period of radical secularism, top-down secularization. We know it is both a political period of political reforms as well as cultural change, cultural reforms. And the secular ideas were put in place. So we see this emergence of the secularist political center. Now, it's a big discussion in the Turkish studies, of course. What are the consequences of this period? You know, what are the products of this? I think the positive side of this, I mean, if you're just looking at this experience. First of all, Turkey was able to construct an overarching national identity. This is not an easy task. This is something that many countries in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East tried to accomplish, but they failed to accomplish. You know, we can talk about this more if this. But this is a challenge for any new nation state, and Turkey, we can reasonably say that was quite successful in establishing this new Turkish national identity. Another accomplishment is state building. A lot of countries, new nation states that were established under similar circumstances, failed to become viable states. In the Turkish case, we do see strong state building. In fact, perhaps even it's too successful because we have in Turkey too much state at the end. You know, we do definitely see a strong state. And you know, many people have also argued that it helps to achieve you know, the level of political, economic, and cultural development that Turkey has reached today. When especially people come to Turkey from the Middle East, what strikes them is actually from their perception, how Western or how in a way developed Turkey is in many ways. And a very important reason for that is the institutions actually that were established during that period. But the deficit side, on the deficit side, however, first of all, there was a high price paid for these. It complicated Turkey's linkage with its historical and cultural heritage. And it had some long-lasting impact in this sense. It also created a disgruntled group of Muslim conservative modernizers in Turkey because they were left out of the mainstream. These institutions were not established with their involvement, not with their in an inclusive process where they also had a say and shared in this process of state building and institution making, but they felt actually left out. And one result of this is, I think, one of the deeper cleavages or fissures that typically emerge between secular nationalists and Islamist elites in Muslim countries in response to modernization and westernization. Similar cleavage exists in many countries. I think you go to Egypt, you go to Lebanon, you go to Tunisia. There is a very similar cleavage between secular and religious political actors. An ideological cleavage, two different worldviews about the future of the country, what is the ideal societal model, what is the ideal political model, what is the ideal path of modernization. Two different views. Sometimes they are quite mutually exclusive as well. So this is hard to compare, but I think it probably led this period led to one of the deeper cleavages among Muslim countries, I think. But something, of course, this is the foundation period. The next period, however, is also very important because I think it's quite remarkable and needs to be analyzed more carefully. We do actually see the moderation of secular politics in beginning from 1946, and the emergence of a semi-democratic center. In the article, I talk about this in more detail. The nature of the center, but the center has political, social, international dimensions, but also the universal and country-specific dimensions. So, on a universal level, first of all, there's this transition to multi-party electoral democracy. Many other countries, from Nigeria to Iraq, they have actually experimented with this as well. Having some kind of a competitive politics, having multi-party politics, they have tried to do this. But in all of the, in them, actually, those experiences are very short-lived, actually. In the Turkey, and usually what happens is that there are some elections, but when the incumbent powers lose the elections, then they cancel the elections and they don't allow the rotation of power, the peaceful rotation of power. In Turkey, it is, I think, quite remarkable that electoral democracy became institutionalized, and in the first free and fair elections in 1950, when the Republican People's Party lost the elections, it basically left the government and allowed the opposition to come to power. And of course, then we had the military coups and so on. But in general, the electoral democracy itself, not the pluralistic or full democracy, but electoral democracy in Turkey became quite institutionalized. We also see the practical moderation of secularism. Think of the secular practices of the 1920s, 1930s. Think of, for example, the vernacularization of the ezan, call to prayer. It's making the secular attempt to make Islam more national. So this is a quite radical step. The religious education during the 1930s was really minimized. It was very limited, just to educating just a few leaders of prayer. Many the Sufi brotherhoods were except for a few, they were basically shut down. These are all radical practices. We do see after the 1946, when the Republican People's Party faced electoral competition, we do see actually practical moderation of this practice. For example, later in 1951, the call to prayer was changed back to Arabic. The Sufi brotherhoods, they found more and more with the electoral democracy, they found more opportunities and more room to operate, and so on. So this actually reflects a compromise with pious median voters, because if you talk about the center, the social component of the center in an electoral democracy is the median voters, and the median voters in Turkey were basically pious Muslims in general. So when the secular party had to win elections, then they tried to compromise actually with them, and they moderated their secular practices. This actually also reflects a compromise with the post-Second World War international context, because Turkey was threatened by the Soviet Union. At the time, the policymakers made the decision to join the Western camp, and the norm in the Western camp was electoral democracy. That was also an attempt to compromise with them. But here, I think the moderation of secularism here, we do see the softening of the secular practices, but I see practical moderation for a purpose, because we might also ask why we only observed only the emergence of a semi-democratic center. Because actually, if you think about it, 1950 is a big lost opportunity for Turkey. I mean, you see a period of state building. For a nation state, what are the challenges? First, build a state national identity, create a viable national identity, and then, you know, allow competitive politics, peaceful rotation of power. So this is a time where when democracy could be consolidated in Turkey. But instead, actually, we see the emergence of a semi-democratic center, not a fully democratic one, not a liberal democratic one, but we see a semi-democratic center. And the reason is, I think, this moderation compromise was a practical one, but not a formal one. In other words, we see this lack of institutionalization of the secular moderation. The changes were institutionalized through explicit and formal, the changes were not institutionalized through explicit and formal compromises between Muslim and secular actors to produce the norms and rules of a fully democratic center. So we don't see in Turkey a process where during the 1950s the representatives of the secular elites and religious conservative elites sitting around this table like here, and basically maybe something similar that people are trying to do in Tunisia, in Egypt right now, trying to reconcile their differences, especially ideological differences. The secular vision of modernization and the religious conservative vision of modernization. They did not agree on a constitution, for example, or legal framework that would basically allow room for each vision. Instead, the changes occurred through political clientelism. All parties, when they came to power, they were involved in clientelistic politics, so they made concessions to voters and concessions to societal actors through recruitment policies in the government. Many more, think of the Imam Hatip schools in Turkey. The number of the Imam Hatip schools increased constantly with the multi-party politics, but there is no time in the history where, in fact, the secular and religious actors got together and even agreed on the fact that these were schools for people who want to get a more religious education. Even
the changes were not.
Exactly, of course.
You forgot the word not.
That I mentioned it, but thanks for, it can make a big difference. It's either not, or I could put a I wish at the beginning. So something like that. Yeah, thanks for that. So basically no intellectual reconciliation between the two potentially mutually exclusive ideals of modernization. But of course, you know, that does, for democratization, you don't necessarily need people to really reconcile their different ideologies. I mean, that's too much to expect. But they need to reconcile their intellectual differences, ideological differences, to the extent that they can agree on joint rules of the game. Okay, I mean, if these differences are too great, of course, they can't even agree on the rules of the game of politics. But if they could reconcile enough, then they could actually really come up with a institutional framework, legal framework that would allow, that would set the rules of the game, which would be satisfying to actually both sides. So now coming to the 1990s and the 2000s, this semi-democratic center, I think, endured with very important changes, of course, that we are all familiar with. What we see in the 2000s, during the 1990s, we see the transformation of the political Islamism, and it gained ground electorally, and the experiences of the Welfare Party, and then the Virtue Party, and then the Justice and Development Party. And Justice and Development Party came to power as a result. In the 2000s, we see, in that sense, the moderation of the religious politics, but also the secular demoderation. Actually, during the 2000s, we saw that many secular actors, and think of the Social Democrats, for example, who earlier on experimented with the idea of Anatolian left. And what is Anatolian left? Anatolian left is a leftist ideology which is more responsive to society and more responsive to the religious sensitivities of the society and so on. An attempt to connect with the voters beyond political clientelism. So, but we know that actually during the 2000s they took a much more radical defensive approach vis-a-vis the Justice and Development Party. So, and what is this the transformation of the Muslim politics? And if we think about the Justice and Development Party, and then we have evidence for this. One is that we see that first the religious and Islamist discourse was very much suppressed. If you compare, for example, the political program or programs and the discourse of the Justice and Development Party, comparing it to the Welfare Party and so on, we see that the religious and Islamist discourse is much less employed, much less visible. The adoption of the discourse of the liberal democracy as opposed to majoritarian democracy, and that's, I think, quite salient in the discourse of the Justice and Development Party in its first period. If you go to 2002, then the speeches of the leaders of the Justice and Development Party really sounded like a leader from a European Union country. They were talking about freedoms, and they were talking about rights, and they were talking about consensus, right, as the European Union model is. Also the embracing Western alliances, the EU project, the Turkish EU project, embracing it, and also embracing economic globalism. Justice and Development Party is one of the most liberal economic actors in Turkish history, from privatization to an open economy model. So here, so what I want to do now is, so about this, I want to give you also some figures from my empirical research, and I want to show you that we have to look at democratization in a different way, rather than discussing which actor and focusing on the identity of the actor is more democratic, is more supportive of democracy. Actually, we have to focus on other issues. So, in my research, I'm trying to find empirical support for a more nuanced conceptualization of democratization. So remember, I said that we cannot actually compare. I mean, we cannot talk about who are the Democrats in a country without comparing it to its political rivals and without comparing it to the center of that country. So, and what I work with is with my content analysis project. In this content analysis project, in the first period between, I looked at all the issues of Yeni Şafak, Zaman, and Milli Gazete, and Milliyet and Cumhuriyet between the years of 1996 and 2004. And then in 2007 and 2010, I compared Yeni Şafak and Zaman with Hürriyet and Milliyet. So it actually covers more than 50,000 articles, so the sample is actually very large and therefore representative, rather than focusing on a few columnists or writers. We can actually really measure, take a picture of a very broad spectrum of the elites who actually write in these newspapers. It's a very large project, so on a number of issues that you can see here. You can see the numbers of the articles looked at on different subjects and so on. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all. But what I want to show you is this. So then I would distinguish first of all the idea of nominal democracy. So what I mean with this is the desirability of democracy as a general concept. So it is, we can show that in that sense that has been an important change in Turkey. So if you compare the support of liberal democracy and electoral democracy, and here we are looking at the religious conservative press, right? Yeni Şafak, Zaman, Milli Gazete. And you see that comparing the period 1996 to 1999 with the period 2001-2004, the support for electoral democracy increased to 71%, liberal democracy 76%. If you leave out Milli Gazete, which is much more reflective of the Milli Görüş ideology, national outlook ideology, the increase is actually much more drastic. From 66% to 81%, and negative views also decreased. Liberal democracy increased from 76 to 87%. In Milli Gazete, in fact, the support for electoral democracy decreased, remained the same for liberal democracy. Obviously, something ideational change occurred within the religious elite, and as a result. So as far as nominal democracy is concerned, if I compare this whole period and the religious and the secular press, support for nominal democracy is more or less the same. 71% versus 73%. And there's some difference in the negative views as well, but they converged actually on each other. Another example of nominal democracy, social pluralism as a desirable value. When we think of the nominal democracy or democracy in general, we don't just think of elections. What we think is how free are people to live the way they want? Do they feel, with their differences, do they feel safe at home to live and so on? How desirable is this? Ethnic, religious, lifestyle, ideological differences in social life. There, the secular press comes out much more open to social pluralism. The positive views are 59% and negative views are 11% in the secular, whereas 38% positive and 36% negative in the religious press. So we do see a difference, that important difference there. Although this part of the research is not complete yet, just for the year 2007, at least comparing Milliyet and Zaman, the difference seems to have been actually decreased. So in the Zaman in 2007, the positive views are 66% and negative views are 13%. Another concept of nominal democracy, nationalism. Now, it is very often argued that many problems of Turkey's democracy are related to nationalism. Ethnic pluralism, for example, the Kurdish issue. And you can see this implicit or explicit hypothesis that religious actors are less nationalist. Therefore, they have more potential to successfully address challenge of ethnic diversity. Because rather than relying on a secular national identity or ethnic Turkishness, they can rely on a unifying, maybe Muslim identity. They are less nationalist, and therefore they have more potential to address these questions. So nationalism can, of course, really can suppress difference, right? Suppress differences, and has a tension with democracy, even though in itself it's not a problem for democracy. All the nation states have their nationalism, and they can be very democratic. But a certain kind of nationalism can, of course, prevent democratization. So when we look at the religious press as a whole, we see that the religious press in general, as a group, is less nationalist. It's more critical of nationalism. The critiques of nationalism is about 20% versus 9%, and the positive views on nationalism are more in the secular press. But if you look more carefully on a newspaper by newspaper basis, in fact, there is not a clear distinction between the newspapers. Cumhuriyet newspaper comes out as the most nationalist, followed by Zaman, followed by Milli Gazete, followed by Yeni Şafak, and the least nationalist comes out as the Milliyet newspaper. So the religious papers are clustered in between, and the most nationalist one is a secular paper, but the least nationalist is also a secular paper. Yeni Şafak and Milliyet are more similar to each other than they are to Milli Gazete, and in that sense, even though they have different conceptions of nationalism, of course, Zaman and Cumhuriyet newspaper are actually more similar to each other. I also looked at the nationalism in 2007, and Milliyet's. I think in Zaman newspaper it's decreased. Actually, the level of nationalism seems to have decreased in 2007. But the nationalism in itself is neither a hindrance nor a facilitator for democratization in the specific issue areas. I mean, there is no evidence that actually nationalists were never able to establish the democracy in a country or something or not. What is actually the issue for democracy is what I call effective democracy. So, in a non-democratic case, say dictatorship or authoritarian state, the challenge, the challenge is actually to establish elections, have some kind of a basic democracy. But in a semi-democracy like Turkey, and Turkey is a democracy. What are the challenges of democracy in Turkey? They are not about the general support for democracy. Even the most radical activists, they will say, okay, democratization is the solution. It's actually really that it's a series of specific reforms. And think of the challenge of democratization in Turkey, the headscarf question. So what kind of a constitutional change, what kind of a law will actually allow more freedom for everybody, whatever their preference is or whatever their actually identity or lifestyle is. What are we going to do? Are we going to change the constitution? What is the reform? What is the legal change? Institutional what? Think of the Kurdish issue. Education in Kurdish or the broadcasting. A bunch of problems that that need to be resolved in one way or another, some kind of an institution. And do actors have the values and beliefs that would allow the actual democratization in these areas? Women's rights. Turkey is, if I'm not wrong, 124th among 140-something countries in terms of the status of women. I mean, participation in the labor force, participation in the in politics. I mean, Turkey is one. I mean, if somebody came from the space with some education in political theory and wanted to ask what is the most disenfranchised group in Turkey, probably women, 50% of the population, they are disenfranchised, economically, politically. So what are we going to do about this? In the Western world, in the world in general, there are some methods used to promote women's rights. For example, affirmative action policies or quotas and so forth. I mean, of course, there can be other policies, but has there been discussion of this? Should we use quotas? Should we use other policies or affirmative action to make women more equal? Now, the results are actually drastic because there is almost, for example, with respect to affirmative action type of policies, there can be many different types of affirmative action policies for women. There has been very little discussion of this in the religious press. if you have not discussed something, then you also you cannot know how to resolve it. Right? There is more discussion in the secular press because it's also two newspapers. So these numbers in parentheses, they show how many times this idea was discussed or quoted. And on average, it was discussed much more in the secular press. Think of the Alevi question. The Alevis are another disenfranchised group in Turkey. They have a lot of demands, such as the recognition of their house of prayer, representation in the Diyanet, Director of Religious Affairs. They have a lot of demands and they have issues. So, how are these problems going to be resolved? Is the Diyanet going to be maybe more decentralized or maybe abolished? Is it going to be more representative? Is there going to be another institution for this? Or how? I mean, how? There are some people who don't feel included, okay, and they have issues. How are these problems going to be resolved? So, and they're also an important portion of society. So you would expect a big chunk of discussion on this, but there is actually very little discussion again on this. The idea was quoted over 9 years in 3 newspapers in the religious press, 47 times, the positive views. In total, about 110 times. There's much more discussion on the secular press, but I'm sorry, in the secular press it was about 120. In the religious press, on the right-hand side, it's basically 33 times this subject was quoted. I mean, in one way or another. But no discussion on the, in 2007, a more specific question, Alevi representation in Diyanet. There was very little discussion of this. I mean, there might have been more, but basically in the sample that I had, very little discussion of this. So here the issue is not necessarily positive or discussion, because maybe Alevi representation in Diyanet is not a very good idea, perhaps. It can be discussed, there can be pros and cons. But lack of discussion is a problem in itself, because first of all, no attempt to find a way and maybe to reconcile. And also lack of knowledge, because if you don't discuss something, then you don't know. These are complicated problems. You don't know actually how this complicated issues. The Kurdish issue, I have similar findings. I'll just skip this in the interest of time. But I have argued elsewhere as well. On the Kurdish issue, also we can say actually the same thing. So, to conclude, actually, for the moderation and democratization, I propose the following framework. So we can talk about several scenarios. If moderation takes place in the presence of a democratic center in a country like the United States, then that will further democratization. More people, more regions will enjoy the freedoms and rights upheld by the center, by the constitution, and so on. And we can also see that moderation will probably be sustained. The problem is fundamentally different if moderation takes place in the presence of an undemocratic or semi-democratic center, which is also the case in Turkey. And under scenario B, then we can talk about several possibilities. Scenario B1, we could imagine that a hegemonic moderate actor builds, sorry again a typo here, I'm sure we will realize before the preemptive strike, right? A hegemonic actor can unilaterally build a more democratic center. I mean, similar things have happened in the world. In Japan, the Liberal Democrat Party actually established a democratic system. In Sweden, Social Democrats actually did it. This can happen, I think, if, for example, if it has a very strong, very well-developed pluralist ideology. In other words, transcending the values of the center. More democratic, more pluralist than the center with which it has compromised. Or it can have very strong external support. Again, a hegemonic actor hegemonic actor meaning that it has very strong political support, right? Does control the parliament, has very high electoral support, right? And it can have very strong external support. In Japan, that was the case, right? The United States was a very strong external anchor, and they really supported democratization there. But what if these conditions are not there? Scenario C1. I think this scenario C1 fits the Turkish case, and also the cases in the Middle East. In this case, the moderating actor will retain its own authoritarian values, and it will also adapt or reproduce the center's authoritarian characteristics. So it will maybe reproduce the center's characteristics, maybe with a different look, formally looking different, but it will actually be as authoritarian as the other one. Because it will also be quite convenient, I think, convenient to govern. Because what is an authoritarian state? I mean, the institutions of an authoritarian state are very convenient for a hegemonic actor. I mean, you can do a lot by using the authoritarian instruments of the state. And in return, its rivals will become threatened, and they will also become uncooperative. So under these conditions, I think there will be a problem. That will be a problem, because the problem for these countries is to build a democratic center. If that doesn't happen with one dominant actor doing it by using its electoral support, by using its powers, then cooperation will be necessary to build a new democratic center. Cooperation, and then hence we come actually to the title of my presentation. I see this as a major challenge and major problem, because for a case like Turkey and also like Tunisia or Egypt, cooperation between religious and secular actors are very important, because they need to use their political agency to overcome their differences. Not entirely, I mean, obviously they will remain different, but enough to sit at the same table so they can actually agree on the norms, institutions, rules of the game of a more democratic center. Okay, thank you very much. This is where I can start.
Thank you for this thought-provoking, I hope, food for thought talk. If we could turn it into a conversation, it would be even better. I would, of course, as academics, we would love to discuss all these issues all together, but I would also like to give a chance, opportunity to students today, to raise their hands. And I know you would. Hossam is a very active, energetic, and very participatory sort of kind of student, so he will, I know you. But the others should also please come up, okay? So I saw Talha as the first hand.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Talha, I'm also with the science department. I have lots of questions actually, and lots of things. I would like to see the research, but one thing I would like to mention is that I think the international context was very important for the moderation of Turkey's political regime. I mean, in 1920s, 40s, in the single-party regime, order of things was fascism and authoritarianism, and NATO played an important role in Turkey's development. EU was also another step, and now we are experiencing the Arab Spring, and I think it will also have some influence on development of Turkey's political context. So my first question is, how do you think it will affect, and do you think it will have a remarkable influence like EU process or NATO integration, or do you think it will be less significant? And the other question really about your research is, I mean, how did you make the connection between the newspaper articles and political transformation? I couldn't make that theoretical, just my curiosity. Thank you.
Should we take more questions, or
would you like to? It's up to you.
I could actually, yeah, maybe just respond right now and I mean, the international context is definitely very important during the 1940s as well as during the 2000s, and there's no question about that. I think that's why I conceptualized the center with as having an international dimension, because this is something I think is missing in the theoretical approaches. I think this attempt to also gain the acceptance of the Turkey's international allies, have a seat internationally, is very important in the Turkish elites changes, and that was the case during the 1940s as well as the 2000s, and that explains a lot, I think. But I think it's not. But I think it's not the only factor, however, because and we can test this. I mean, if we take the 1930s, the secular elites, if they had been monolithic, and there were no actually there were no moderates among them, right? But then the international context changes, and then they allow multi-party democracy. Then we could say that, okay, so the international context is the only explaining factors. But if we can find that there were also what we can call moderates among them, who were, for example, more open to political competition, to the idea of political competition, and who were also relatively more tolerant of public religion, more open to societal demands for more religion in public life, then the explanation should include also the domestic factors. And the same we can say, I think, about political Islamism. So when you look at the Welfare Party, it was not monolithic. There was this wing that later, the reformist wing, that later actually established the Justice and Law Party. So international context is again very important, but it's not the only explaining factor. As far as the connection between but in that sense, for Turkey, I think the future of democracy, I mean, from the point of view of the international context, doesn't look very bright. Why? The EU process, I don't need to explain, is not going much further. No side wants to kill it, right? Either they want to kind of go, but it's not really, it's not a strong anchor for Turkish democratization. As far as the rest of the Western world is concerned, I don't think they are, given Turkey's role in the Middle East and in NATO and in other alliances, I don't think they are really interested in Turkey becoming a very full democracy. They wouldn't like Turkey to become a dictatorship, but I don't think they care so much about how good a democracy Turkey is, how strong the rights and freedoms are. The connection between the politics and this content analysis. So I'm looking at the relationship between elite values and later changes in political behavior. So usually we do this by using other methods, which are also very, very valuable. But we are missing certain things, because if we are, say, we interview say 10, 15 political actors today, the first of all sample is small, but having a small sample has its own advantages. But on the other hand, I think there are some other issues. We are not talking to actors who existed perhaps 10 years ago or 8 years ago. They were politically important, they expressed certain ideas, but maybe they were sidelined, and they are no longer very much out there. Plus, there is this difference between the speech in a kind of interview context and a public speech. And in interview context, first of all, of course, the political actors, they are very skilled in representing themselves. I mean, that's what they do, right? They are projecting a vision, and they try to promote themselves. We try to overcome this because as researchers we have our own weapons. To some extent we can overcome that. But even more important than that, they basically express their own recollection, their own subjective recollection, memory of why things happened, how they happened, and their role in it. And whatever they say there in an interview context is not really binding to them anyway, right? I mean, we academics don't 5 years later go and hold them accountable for what they said. So, looking at a broader sample of elites, think of the people who write in the newspapers, and they write they include journalists, but Turkish journalists don't usually see themselves as just reporters. I'm sure you all know. I mean, they are a very important part of the elites. They think they have a mission. I mean, they want to influence society. They want to actually shape the views of their views. But also politicians, academics, civil society actors write in Turkish newspapers. It's a very broad, actually, platform. So, if you can see that some political changes in the changes of political behavior are compatible with prior changes, ideation changes in this platform, then we can build actually reasonable link. So, especially the way that I conceptualize the democracy, we see that certain issues are discussed, and sometimes the dominant view changes, and later we see that some of the political actors also change their behavior accordingly.
I would like to a little bit problematize, I would like you to problematize the concepts religious and secular. I think this is too binary categorization, too much binary categorization for me, because being religious and being secular are not necessarily the opposite ends of a spectrum. One can be religious and secular at the same time. And those people whom we call secular, and in your presentation, in terms of newspapers, I can see that, for example, Cumhuriyet being categorized as secular is very problematic because in many issues, when it comes to many issues, the mindset still operates with a religious baggage. That's in the formation of the Kemalist identity. There is a very strong ingredient of religion. Especially you see that in Turkish nationalism, and also when it comes to Alevi inclusion, the lack of support, even the rejection of discussion of the Alevi question is a reflection of a deeper intellectual mindset which operates with the influence of religion. And that's one thing. I think it's possible to reformulate this in multiple ways. So you need a little bit more flexibility when it comes to categories. Religious versus secular, just I think is too limited. It also more specific about the cases. For example, when we discuss the women issue and the support for women political participation in the secular category, I want to little bit. I wonder why it appeared like that, because I also believe and I observe that there is, I think Turkey's most important question when it comes to women political participation is the participation in politics with headscarf, because about half of the population, I don't know exact numbers, but half the population choose to wear headscarf, and they are rejected from participating in politics. And when it comes to that issue, there is a complete denial of that right, that political right and that human right, in the secular press. So how come you categorize that as being more positive when it comes to women and political participation? And that also didn't seem to be very convincing for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe starting with the second question, I think is easier to answer. First of all, I don't think that the headscarf question is the most important barrier before women's political participation in Turkey. I don't think this is the case. If that had been the case, then, for example, within the Justice and Development Party, we would see a lot more women in the leadership position or in the higher positions within the party. So obviously there is no, so there is a, for example, we can explain why there are no members of parliament with the headscarf question. That is a viable hypothesis, and I think that's a big problem because there is a ban on this, some kind of I think regulation, and we can hypothesize that that's maybe an important reason why there are not more women in the parliament. But since in places where there is no headscarf ban, and especially even among conservative actors who are not, should not be against the headscarf, we see a similar disenfranchisement, a similar underrepresentation. I think I strongly believe that the problem of women in Turkey is way beyond, without dismissing the problem of headscarf, way beyond the headscarf question. With respect to the findings that I showed, that was on the discussion on the affirmative action question. So I looked at the headscarf question separately. Yeah, I mean, in the secular press, of course, the secular press, that question is not sufficient to discuss. So that is the problem in the secular press. So I couldn't show all the results. I just wanted to show some examples to you. So it doesn't mean that the secular actors are more prepared to give more rights or to women in every way. So they have also not discussed some important issues. But that specific question, the affirmative action kind of policies, there we see a drastic difference. So the religious and secular, if you have a suggestion, I would be very open to it.
Secularist, I would say. Instead of secular, secularist.
But then, in order to be parallel, you have to say Islamist. You can't say once, a group of secularists. I mean, Milliyet, a lot of people who write in Milliyet, can you call them secularist? And then, you have to call everybody who writes in Yeni Şafak or Zaman Islamist. That would also be very problematic. So, definitely the religious secular is problematic. It is more understandable in English than in Turkish. In Turkish, then we can use dindar, laik, which is also a problem. I tried to use the religious conservative and muhafazakar, which is sometimes used. This is also very problematic because muhafazakar means somebody who wants to retain, and muhafaza etmek, retain something. Is this the case in Turkey? I mean, it is. So it is very problematic. However, so this is basically an imperfect terminology. I completely agree with this, but this is the best I could find. So if you, I would agree with it. But one, however, justification for this imperfect terminology is the empirical evidence. Because I wanted to first of all see if we can talk about two groups. I mean, I did not decide beforehand, or I did not rule out prior to the research that there is a group, Hürriyet, Milliyet, Cumhuriyet, and another group, Zaman, Yeni Şafak, and Milli Gazete. If I found that, if I didn't find any meaningful difference between the two, then I would not even use this terminology. But if you look at the findings, in many areas, some examples I have shown, like nationalism or democracy, nominal democracy, they are not really distinguishable. You cannot talk about two different groups. But anything related to religion, secularism, and social pluralism issues, clearly there are two different groups. And these are issues related to religion. It doesn't mean that the secular are against religion or not religious. It doesn't mean that although the religious elite, they are against secularism, for example, or they may be secular politically, or they may be secular in many ways. But there is a difference related to religion. I mean, obviously they have different conceptions of secularism, and they have different conceptions of somehow religion's place in society or politics.
Yeah, but I mean, giving this concept of secular only to one group and rejecting that concept from the other group because they are religious is problematic, because there are different ways of interpreting secularism, and as political and economic actors, they are also secular. I mean, or as actors in the press, community, so their religiosity is not necessarily a contradiction with their being secular, their secularity. So religiosity is not necessarily a binary category that can be put in contrast with secularity, but it can be done with secularism as an ideology of asserting secularism. And a friend of mine, Ahmet, whom you know, has worked on this and published a book. There are three different interpretations of secularism: assertive secularism and passive secularism. And Kemalists are assertive secularists, whereas other actors, whom we call religious, they are also secular, but they are passive seculars. And you have Tayyip Erdogan, for example, going to Egypt and Tunisia, advocating secularism. But what kind of secularism is advocating? So there are different interpretations. So we should also allow room for religious actors to emerge as secular, and they are doing that. I mean, there's a transformation.
No, sure. But since, I mean, actually, if you say secularist, I think that might become actually more problematic, because what is secular is somebody who defends secularism, the way I understand. Then it would be a bigger problem, because then it would mean that the other side doesn't defend secularism. So I definitely do not have a binary conception, but I see it's a problem of terminology. But with respect to assertive secularism and passive secularism, I think it explains more this foundation period that I'm talking about. But actually it is, I don't think that it is an adequate conceptualization for later periods, and especially for today. First of all, I mean, who are the passive secularists today in Turkey? I mean, passive secularism, the way I understand it, would mean a fuller separation between state and religion. So who defends that in Turkey? I don't see anybody, for example, any actor defending, okay, maybe we should abolish the Diyanet. That would mean a fuller separation of what? Some Alevis defend this, yes, maybe. So we have to ask more whether those people who do they also really, I mean, if they really defend a fuller separation of religion, that they could be. Or compulsory religious education and things like that.
Okay, if I'll give the turn to ask a question to Abdul Rahim. If he can keep it short, because I know him, then we may all have a chance, Please, could you give that?
Thank you very much. Let me start first by saying that I'm still in the album. I have a question, but it's not very long, but it has two simple premises. First, in a democratic or semi-democratic system, change in the center is reflected in the state policies and ideology, yet there is a time span between both. Moreover, the state as a machine, as a construct, has its own reason, that has its own logic. Second, AKP and its ancestor parties represent a shift in the center, or rather marks the failure of the Kemalist elite in achieving their mission. So, to what extent has AK Party been willing and determined to change the policies of the preceding governments, of what, representing what we may call the Kemalist paradigm?
I mean, I'm not sure if I fully followed your question, or two questions. But with respect to the second question, I mean, my argument is that obviously that the Justice and Development Party, especially since 2007, rather than trying to build a new center, transcending, if you want to call it a Kemalist center, has focused more on reproducing a more conservative version of it. So I mean, we have to ask the question whether the relationship between state and society has fundamentally changed. So obviously, you know, the groups that are included or excluded might have changed somewhat. Some groups probably feel more at home or more included. But this is actually temporary because the real idea is that whatever your political state in the future, whatever your identity is, whatever your political status is, do all the Turkish citizens feel that they are really protected by a democratic state. So that's the idea. I mean, we have lots of, I mean, Turkey doesn't still just passes as a semi or partially free democracy in international organizations. Well, you can always argue that they are biased and they are against Turkey. But this is what the state used to say during the 1990s. Whenever an international organization rates Turkey and it doesn't come out favorable to Turkey, then the governments used to say, well, Western bias, I mean, they don't understand us, and you know, they are, you know, who are they talking to, and that's basically what the state used to say during the 1990s and early. So in that sense, we see that, you know, a reproduction of the center's values. Obviously, you know, Justice and Development Party, it has a different political identity. But in terms of how it is behaving, responding to this kind of challenge, how it is responding to societal opposition, fundamentally, I think it looks very similar. I mean, it seems to be quite visible.
How is this reflected in its policies, its agenda, its practices? How is this now changing attitude towards the center? How was it reflected in its policy during the last 10 years, or especially the last 5 or 4 years?
And there's a long story.
That's a very long question, which deserves a long answer. So you're going to keep it short too, right?
Sure.
So that, yeah.
I just, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I just wonder about the position of military in your conception of democratization before 2000 and after 2000. And what about the relation between military and the elite sector and all these elements?
Yeah. Yes, and thanks for asking this question. That's a really important part of the picture, of course. Sumita will be the best person.
Because it was missing, I'm so sorry.
Yes, actually.
We're talking about democracy.
Obviously, yeah. No, I mean, no, that's actually the article I talk about this. But no, you're absolutely right. So when I say that, I'm not arguing at all that no change has occurred. Actually, what I mean, with respect to civil-military relations, the way I see, I can refer to you, but I mean, it seems to have changed much more in the direction of democracy. I mean, definitely the civilian, elected government seems to have much more in control. I don't know if the civil-military relations have been completely normalized. I don't think so, because that's something that will take a long time with the change of the culture within the military. And another aspect of that is the attitude of the secular actors. In my research, findings that I have not shown here, in the secular press, there was actually very little support for military intervention in politics. Actually, very, very little. But in the context of protecting secularism, there was more support. So much more ambiguity, and and there's some significant significant support. Actually, I think in the Turkish case we see something interesting. We can ask why the political Islamists in society were some of the most dynamic elements in Turkish society during the 1990s. And that's again a long story. But one aspect of this might have been that they did not rely on the state, and they were excluded by the state to different degrees. I mean, it's a more complicated story than a lot of the narratives tell, because they were also supported very much. Not everybody was excluded, not everybody excluded all the time. They were included in some periods and so on. But because they did not rely on the state, perhaps that's a hypothesis, but they relied on grassroots movements, and they had to rely on themselves. Maybe, I don't know whether the seculars are, if they will undergo, they will go through a similar experience, which is not an ideal way, because I think it will take for Turkey for another decades. We don't need to reinvent the world. I mean, we know how democracy works. The real prospect is that, of course, compromise and coming together and build a more democratic center. But we see an interesting thing that recently, it seems to me, I don't know, just based on just observation, seculars they become in the last Republican Day, for example, we saw that some mobilization of civilian secular actors, and they clashed with the state. Isn't that interesting? I mean, so maybe then that will lead to a more grassroots kind of mobilization among them also. But it would, for the Islamist side, perhaps the other way around is correct. Maybe because they can rely on the state more right now. So they will perhaps lose some of their civilian characteristics. So at the end, as far as democracy is concerned, much changes. Much is not changing, right? Maybe actors are changing, but at the end, it's the result in terms of the democratic state, a democratic center. It doesn't change that much.
I know you're going to ask something. Could I say something? Can I give myself totally? Because before we forget about it, I would like to sort of say something related to what Professor Kösebal'an said. I mean, Hasan granted that yes, religious and secular stories are full of problems, and they disguise, I think, more overlapping religions within themselves. I still appreciate this attempt, this effort to sort of relate the two categories in a mutually transformative way. That's basically what I think Professor Somer is doing. These two categories are what we call, what I called in my book, interactive categories to some extent, but what you're seeing is a step further. They are mutually transformative and they are mutually dependent on each other, the secular and religious categories. So I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate this, your attempt to try to theoretically reframe this relationship, whether it's perfect or imperfect, but you know, the attempt that it needs to be appreciated. But the point I have in mind is this, or the problem I have in mind is different. Now, when we say they are mutually dependent, when I look at Turkey's, what do you call, neo-Islamism, post-Islamism, AKP Islamism, definitional problems, Turkey's Islamism in the 21st century and its democratic commitments and achievements after 2002 seems to me a product of, at least to a very large extent, a product of what you called secular demoderation of the 28th of February process, for instance. So this destroys your thesis in a way, to some extent. Or I'm sure you're going to make it up. You're going to bring it EU. You're going to bring in EU as it. What I'm trying to say is that a moderate center does not always or does not necessarily produce a moderate Islamic politics. Not always. There are exceptions to it, like the case after 28th of February. I mean, the Kemalist center, rather than moderating itself, it used repressive, authoritarian, exclusionary policies towards Turkey's Islamist policies or politics.
But just to, yeah, I mean, but no, I mean,
but they turned moderate.
No, I fully agree with you. Actually, no. My argument is in a country with a democratic center, then the moderate policies of the center would produce moderate actors who would also contribute to democratization. I fully agree with you. In the Turkish case, what happened is the semi-democratic center demoderated late 1990s, clashed with the political Islamism and really tried to exclude it. And that led to the transformation, moderation of the yeah, and I show this empirically actually, because I show this actually with the findings. This is something that has been argued by others, including myself as well, but here I'm also able to show this empirically, because not everybody agrees with the argument. But we have empirical basis right now to test this hypothesis, and it's verified, because all these findings with respect to nominal democracy, there is a drastic break after the February 28th process. So basically, what led to this transformation with respect to nominal democracy is really that clash, that exclusive policy or exclusive step by this secularist semi-democratic center. So I fully agree with you. So that transformation occurred because of a demoderated, kind of exclusive center. But it did not lead to democratization at the end. It led to a transformation, but it did not lead to a democratization, because without building a fully democratic center, it leads to the moderating actor to reproduce the center. What is moderation? It's a compromise with the center. You compromise with the center and you come to own the center. You see yourself more identified with the center, and you basically adopt the center's authoritarian values. You reproduce them with your own, meshing them with your political identity. There's a different, of course, discourse to form, but at the end, the authoritarian characteristics remain in place. So that's my argument. So in the period between 2002 and 2007, I think Turkey had a good opportunity to build a fully democratic center. And there were actually many reforms during that time, and maybe some partial response to your policies. There's a lot of writing on this. It's a remarkably reformist period, actually. There were many reforms made, and the civilian-military relationship changed after 2007, right? So these are really important changes. Another remarkable phenomenon about this is just look at how all these reforms were passed. They were passed with inter-party cooperation. They were not actually, I mean, there was actually remarkable cooperation. Just look at the facts. I mean, that we know who voted for what. There was remarkable inter-party cooperation until 2007. So, I asked myself, what made this possible? So, unfortunately, my argument is that unfortunately what made this possible was some authoritarian characteristics, authoritarian insurances as far as secularists are concerned, built into the system. For example, the president, Ahmet Necdet Sezer. So if you look at that period, so Ahmet Necdet Sezer vetoed so many laws that was passed, more according to the wishes of the government rather than the opposition. So it kind of checked some of the actions of the government. It vetoed so many recruitment decisions of the government, more conservative recruitments into the government. Sezer always, and it kind of overstepped his authorities actually, because in a parliamentary democracy, the president should not have this much power. And the existence of the military as some kind of insurance for the secularists. So this is, of course, not a democratic way of ensuring religious, secular, or inter-party cooperation. And of course, everything fell apart in 2007. Right? There was a confrontation between the military and secularists, some secularists on one hand, and the government. And then the government did not step back. And then in 2008, there was an attempt to ban the party, and then it was not banned at the end. So the civilian-military relationship changed, and a lot of things. But the seculars actually demoderated. They became much more defensive. So what happened after 2007? After 2007, first of all, this whole inter-party cooperation seems to have disappeared. This needs to be actually explained. And of course, the government itself, I mean, before 2007, the government itself was much more conciliatory and open to compromise, and it used a very different discourse. I literally remember once remarking that the party that sounds most like a party from the European Union was the Justice and Development Party. I mean, the discourse was always talking about compromise, freedom, rights, democracy, equality, fairness, and all these things. Now, if you compare the discourse after 2007, increasingly, is very different. And it needs to be explained, actually, it needs to be explained what happens.
I wasn't a student of Turkish politics. After listening to your presentation, I would come to the conclusion that now, after 10 years of Party experience, we have a semi-democratic system like the one between 1946 and 1970s. So I think we should be much more focused on the difference between two semi-democratic systems. What's the difference? And again, maybe related to this one, I want to ask a question about headscarf issue. For example, can you find a difference between Islamist press speaking on headscarf issue in 1996 and 2007. Is there a difference? Is there an increasing debate about this corruption, or are they silent on it, in spite of their hegemonic position in the system? And what's the explanation for that? Aren't they pluralistic? Aren't they demanding this stuff? Or something else? Again, another issue is legalization of religious orders. You haven't mentioned any such a issue, but this is very related to Alevite issue. And that's why Republican People's Party is not talking about Alevite issue. And maybe
the lack of legalization of
yeah, of course. And that's another issue that complicates the discussion on the religion and secular cleavage. I think that's enough.
I mean, first of all, I mean, that you know what has changed between 1950s and today. Many things have changed. I mean, first of all, I'm not arguing that you know nothing has changed during the 2000s, for example. I mean, a lot has changed. Remember, you know, semi-democracy is a very broad spectrum. I mean, there's a lot of room for this, but at the end, there's a categorical difference between a full democracy and a semi-democracy, and a semi-authoritarian system, and a non-democracy. So Turkey needs to make this leap from a semi-democratic category to a fully democratic category, which it seems to really not able to accomplish. And again, you know, of course, a lot changes in the positive as well. I mean, the civil-military relations is one aspect of this that we have discussed. But it seems that, you know, there are positive developments in one area, but then there are either no development or sometimes steps back in other areas. You know, indices show this. I mean, the human rights indices and freedoms indices, democracy indices. Obviously, it's just that, you know, all these organizations are not against Turkey or they don't hate Turkey. This is we have the data on this. We seem to not make this leap from semi-democracy to full democracy. I mean, we pay attention to different issues. Of course, it is always possible in Turkey if you basically are doing well individually, right? And you're okay, or you feel better. If you don't pay attention to what is going on in the rest of society, in Turkey it is always possible to feel great. But it has always been like this, right? In the past, you know, there have been groups who felt that, you know, Turkey is a great democracy. They defended it in the international platforms, but that was not the case. You know, with respect to the headscarf issue, I have to go back to the findings. I don't want to tell you anything wrong. So I cannot tell you, I mean, first of all, the 2007, the figures on headscarf, they have not finished yet. But was there less discussion of headscarf in 2004 than 1996?
Within the Islamist space.
Within the Islamist space. I'm not sure. Probably, yeah, I'm not sure. But what seems to have happened to me, and you can tell me what you think, what seems to have happened is that there are really unfulfilled promises, it seems to me. Because at the end, yes, I mean, we have, like, think of the universities that I'm most familiar with. I mean, we have now Şehir University, for example, right? I mean, formally we still have a ban on headscarf in universities. Okay, in practice, it's tolerated, right? And obviously, you know, we have Şehir University, other universities, and nobody does anything. So actually, I think York has published this regulation that it will be allowed. But this is not a law. So this is kind of what I'm trying to tell. What does a fully democratic center mean? That, or I actually give you another interesting example. My students made some research compared. They went to interview Justice and Development Party, which, and they say we are the insurance of secularism in Turkey. Well, a political party cannot be the insurance of secularism of a political party. What we need is not one actor or one political party or one person being insurance of anything, but you need rights. So if I wore a headscarf, then I would not want a person or an actor to tell me that, you know, don't worry, I'm the insurance, it will be okay. I would like to have a law. I would like to have a law which will actually guarantee what my rights are. And then regardless of which government comes to power, then I can actually feel safe. So and the same goes for the legalization of the. So yeah, I fully agree with you, and this is what I'm saying. For example, in Turkey, secularism changed during the 1950s on, in practice. For example, religious orders. I mean, they have been very active in Turkish society since then. I mean, they had newspapers, they had dorms, they had trading houses. I mean, they were very active, but they never had formal rights because still, actually, legally speaking, they are illegal.
So what's the relevance of this silence on getting formal rights on the side of hegemonic Islamists? What's the relevance? Why they are silent on this issue?
I think they don't want to get involved in this difficult process of building a democratic center, which will create a lot of trouble for them. Because that process of building a democratic center through cooperation involves actually sitting together with your political rivals and with seculars. I think the headscarf question for them is not important enough because most of them are men, right? To get into that trouble, right? I mean, then you will probably need to make some concessions in other areas. That will be it's a big debate in the public, right? That will be polarization. I mean, that's my kind of interpretation, but I cannot say for sure because, yeah, I mean, there's an unfulfilled promise, and we need to have a legal framework that will ensure the rights of all women. The way I see it.
But I think you have an answer, and you have a right to hear that answer. I know, actually I know. Just for a conversation.
I was trying to differentiate the type of semi-democratic regime, Kemalist semi-democratic regime and AK Party semi-democratic. Maybe this kind of politics of patience seems to be a kind of negative cooperation. I mean, if the time is not right for actual democratic cooperation, you don't push some demands to the extent that there can be a total breakdown of consensus and cooperation. And you keep it as a demand, but you have a patience. That should be regarded as a kind of cooperation forms. Otherwise, I don't differentiate Kemalist semi-democracy and with the influence of EU and other external factors, we have a democratization in Turkey. We are talking about Kurdish issue. We have an angry prime minister, and he's talking so much, but at the same time, we are giving some rights to the Kurds.
But here is what doesn't change. And let's pay attention to actually the language that you are using. We are saying that we give rights to Kurds. And I have some work on the Kurdish issue, and if you ask me what is the main problem actually with respect to our approach to the Kurdish question.
We as Turkish people.
Mostly Turkish majority, yeah, I would say.
Turkish people of Turkey.
People of Turkey, but of course if you're Kurdish, you have a different kind of, you come from a different background. We've been talking about giving things. And you know what, actually, if we give things, next year, actually, they will want actually more, right? Because the problem is not about, I mean, if you talk to Kurdish actors, and I've done some research in years on this, the issue is not what they actually want, but they actually want to be included. So whatever you give, if you just give, rather than sitting at the same table and somehow going to include them,
in terms of
will not work actually.
In terms of democratization literature, don't you think that it's a kind of naive discourse? Of course, the white Americans gave some rights to the blacks.
No, they did not give rights to the blacks. The blacks actually demanded it. And
Yeah,
at that
there
time,
was a button
Of course, there's
don't know
a
anything about
conflict, armed conflict.
Yeah.
They are demanding, of course.
Yeah,
they are.
but the source, part of the source of the Kurdish conflict, the armed conflict, is that we never, in this semi-democratic country, we never think of establishing new rights and freedoms that are fully legitimate until we face some armed or violent or forceful kind of societal opposition. I mean, we first radicalize them, right? I mean, think of 1970s. Actually, the Kurdish movement was much more peaceful, and the PKK was marginal, actually. Yes, in terms of demands, perhaps for that time, I mean, the Kurdish demand was really radical, but in today's terms, they were not that radical. I mean, right now, talk of much more serious things. So, but they were radicalized because at that time they were not even allowed to express actually these demands.
Yeah, of course, I'm not arguing that we are living in a period of full-fledged consolidated democracy.
I'm not arguing
but
that
what's
we are.
the difference? There should be some other concepts that may explain us the difference between Kemalist semi-democracy and the current one.
And I think that
because this is very important for simply the reason that we may anticipate the future direction of this semi-democracy. Otherwise, I would conclude that this semi-democracy would collapse as well, or would be followed by another semi-democracy by Kemalism, for example.
I think that is possible, or that is also it can endure. I mean, the semi-democracies are not transitional categories. I mean that this is also one major conclusion of the current research, that in fact these categories, semi-democracy, semi-authoritarian, these are not just transitional categories between authoritarian and democracy. I mean, and Turkey is the best example of this. I mean, we basically transitioned to electoral democracy, semi-democracy, in 1950. It's been 62 years, and we still are. So it can be a permanent category. But your other question was very interesting. I mean, it's related to this, the politics of patience issue. I think different actors might have a different motivation for this, and I can totally understand that some actors will think that well, over time there will be, or let me put it this way: I think in Turkey both secular and religious actors are concerned when they use the politics of patience. They don't necessarily mean we're going to wait until there will be a consensus. There will be kind of a right environment for consensus. What they really mean is, if you wait enough, we'll transform the rest of the society enough that everybody will kind of think like us. That's my understanding.
But you can change your demands as well. For Turkish Islamists, for example, there is the simple demand of religious education, and it's that issue, nothing else. You lower you leave some of your demands during the process. Maybe you should see in a much more positive way.
Maybe they are compensated
But
in
maybe
other
you
ways.
should not. I'm sure.
Maybe they are compensated in other ways, financially, other, not only their religious expectations, but some other expectations are already fulfilled.
And they are learning from moderation process.
Yes, but what is that moderation? I think that moderation is the compromise with a semi-democratic system, and I think you're really right. I mean, it is. I mean, I would say that don't lower your expectations. I mean, nobody should lower their expectations. I mean, as far as in Turkey the disenfranchised groups are concerned, whether religious groups, whether women, whether Kurds, Alevis, none of them should lower their expectations, demands. I mean, these are, the question is, are these legitimate demands or not? Many of these demands are basically legitimate demands in terms of the well-established standards of democracy in the world. So nobody should be expected to lower their demands. I mean, I would say don't lower their demands. But maybe you're right. I mean, maybe what is happening is that instead people lower their demands in return for compensation otherwise, because after all, semi-democracy is not that bad. I mean, that's the issue. This is kind of the, it's not that bad. In Latin America, they lived under dictatorship, right? Everybody was, there was no democracy, you know, so they learned that it was so bad, and they made a decision for, things have been bad in Turkey, but they are not that bad. So people kind of, maybe we sell out our souls, I mean, in that sense, and we compromise. But I think we should not. I mean, why not actually have a really full democracy?
So if you change your research design, let's imagine, let's just speculate, I mean, this is for fun. If you change your research design in line with what Professor Duran suggested, you would get rid of this, first of all, the fully democratic center. That doesn't exist. And that, as you said, may never exist anymore. I mean, you said semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic, or semi-moderate system is not ephemeral, it's durable, it's here to stay. It's the business. So, Professor Duran wants you to distinguish between a semi-authoritarian, semi-democratic center, or let's say semi-moderate center, and a semi-moderate Islamic periphery. I don't want to use the word periphery, but that, what shall we say, semi-Islamic or politics actor, or whatever it is. So he says they are not the same. Because this is a very good question, actually. I mean, well, we need to think about it.
They are not the same.
Differentiate between them, he says.
I mean, of course we can differentiate. I mean, the nature of the government, the composition of the disenfranchised groups are different. But we don't. That's not how we measure democracy. And we measure democracy in terms of rights and freedoms and the state-society relationship. I mean, during the 1960s, I think actually Turkey was considered a full democracy for a brief period. I think early 1970s. So, in terms of the vitality of the interest groups and vitality of civilian politics, I mean, think of there was the Labour Party, and there were all kinds of religious Islamist groups. So that's the first emergence of political Islamism. It was a very lively kind of society. If you compare that to today's society, Turkey, it would be very difficult to reach a conclusion. I think definitely, of course, in some ways, Turkey is much more advanced. But also, one thing that we need to include in this is that the standard of democracy is also not constant. I mean, and we cannot actually evaluate Turkey's democracy today with the standards of 1960s. And we have higher expectations right now.
Maybe another problem with your research is the time period between 2007 and 2010. Actually, 2010 was the date for referendum. And just we are talking about 2 years of Party regime. And after
we also have 2003 and 2004.
Yeah, of course. You mentioned 2002 and 2007 coming very near to a consensus. Even the AK Party's rhetoric was different. But After 2007, we had a crisis of presidential elections, and again, this party in 2008 was about to be closed down by the Constitutional Court. So after 2010, there is a hegemony of AK Party, and we are talking about just 2 years. And then there was a reverse, actually, from 2007 to 2010. So these reversals may be included into this analysis. Then we are talking about semi-democracy. Is it very early?
No, I mean, first in terms of research, of course, you can, if I looked at 2012, that would be wonderful too. Give me more money. I would look at 2012 too, it's a time and, research.
Which universities are very rich?
not I got actually outside funding, but I mean, yes, maybe it is possible. I mean, that you can maybe. I mean, I'm not ruling out. I mean, I'm really asking myself actually. I mean, all this that we are seeing, is this maybe something, transition of, just over with years things will settle down, and then we'll become a more normalized kind of democracy. I mean, it is possible. I mean, I'm not. It's just not deterministic, but in that sense, I'm not very optimistic. Actually, for the reasons I have cited. I mean, without cooperation, I don't see. I mean, there is either cooperation or strong external support, or the emergence of a really pluralistic ideology. Other than these conditions, probably, unfortunately, will remain a semi-democracy. But if any of these things change, I think there is more hope.
Actually, maybe you could finish it, because Professor Duran brought up the headscarf issue, and I don't know whether you were in the room. He said it may be the result of politics of patience, a strategy on the part of the AKP to not yet touch a very hot issue, postpone it. In your experience, was it the politics of, or the result of politics of patience, or politics of reluctance? Because we didn't talk about the patriarchy here. I mean, we didn't talk about maybe a return to what we were talking about a while ago, core Islamic, ideology, what we call Islamic assertiveness. Is this the only one single, let's say, area left, enclave left for the AKP party to sort of assert its ideological identity and say no? Or is it patriarchy? What is it?
I mean, during the discussions, when I think about it, I just couldn't find one reason. I mean, at least 3 reasons came to my mind. One is the power relation with the Islamists when they got the governance, and the other is absolutely patriarchy, and still there is a silence, because I mean, even though our party started, flopped the ban in universities, still Mans, Islam Smith ruling the party, and still problems in academia, because I haven't met an academician in headscarf, and I haven't seen a representative with headscarf in Turkish parliamentary. I mean, there is, I think, several reasons.
Nobody talks about the patriarchy.
Yes, no, because men are discussing here, so...
Men are discussing
think about patriarchy, Turkish.
The issue of patriarchy doesn't make a difference in Turkey.
Yeah, between the two sides, yes, there is that. But at least let's give the name to it. I mean, you were considering.
Other than me,
I was thinking that even about headscarf, those are men who are discussing the issue here, even here.
You should have raised your hand.
I
had to ask you.
This topic was discussed at home and my home. There is also another my mom says, I mean, there is no need for you, I mean, for you to get into parliament. I mean, it is enough for you to get education with headscarf. I mean, also in that case, it's also another reason what Professor says. And some expectations were
Partially fulfilled. That makes you satisfied.
And second is power relation with Islamists. After going for it, they got power in Turkey. And third one is patriarchy. That never been told to the Turkey.
But do you think that? But then, I mean, what do then women think? I mean, what do Islamist women think? I mean, then, I mean, you said maybe your mother's generation, but I mean, who are the people you think within the party, within the Islamist movement, who think otherwise? And are they happy with that patriarchy? I mean, as long as women are educated with their headscarf, that's okay, but they don't need actual political power. They don't need actual equality in the workplace. I mean, who contests this? I mean, do you see maybe women who don't want to accept this deal?
Mostly those try to pass those boundaries that's created by men and by their discourse. They just label by feminism, you know. And those no feminist religious women, they just those try to come up with these demands, but generally there is no such.
So this is yani Türkçe konuşabilir miyim bu arada? This is no, I'm really happy to speak in English too. I mean, this is kind of actually an example of it in a way because another semi-democratic context, right? Because women. I don't think, of course, I cannot speak for you. I mean, but I mean, I don't understand, or I cannot understand why women can be satisfied with just having the right to go to the shopping malls and universities to get an education with headscarf, but actually they don't have actual power. Having actual power, I mean, you can actually, maybe in Iran, women have more actual power than in Turkey. I mean, having actual power, as far as Kurds are concerned or other people are concerned, it's not somebody giving you something and then you will be satisfied with it, but actually, having actual power is being equal, meaning that being able to sit at the table, you have a seat at the table. So you have your representatives, you know, within the political party, right? When they discuss something relevant for you, then you have a say as well. You have a say at home, you know, with your husband, you know, domestic politics. And then, I mean, you have, you know, equal rights and power within the civil society. Whatever, you know, that is your part of the civil society involvement. So I just don't understand. I can't. So if we are just satisfied with having more ability to be visible, you know, in shopping malls or universities, and that's not actual democratization. Because the actual democratization is a transition of power. And it's not just from a dictatorship to an electoral government. So after that, after democratic transition, democratization is about actual power transitioning from more and more from those who hold the power to more and more groups, to more and more regions who can actually enjoy
full empowerment.
Full empowerment. And that doesn't end. I mean, there is need for democratization in the United States too, because there are still going on.
Explanation. I think it's an important identity marker and boundary, and it helps both sides of the groups. So it has some advantages to protect the boundaries of the ones, the more conservative side as well. So in that sense, it helps to maintain some of the boundaries, identities, and it has certain privileges in the other side, both of the sides. So that's why it's kept a little bit untouched. So it's an important, I think it's the most important marker.
No, but that's a different question, right? I mean, really, I mean, what do you actually think? But do you think that if, say, there would be actual formal rights for headscarf women, political rights, to be in the parliament and also to be more powerful in the party, just and the local party and so on. Then maybe men in politics, even just in the local party, maybe fear that actually now they will have to sit at the same table and will actually have to share power. But this is not easy for men. Okay? I mean that it's.
I don't think it's about men and women. It's about
secular women.
It's about conservative and more secular.
In what sense? I mean,
it's not about the boundary is not between men and women. It's about the conservative and it's more secular.
This is so similar to, for example, leftists in the past. They used to say that okay, you have to be Marxist and you have to be leftist. And then just basically don't talk about gender. This will, in the future, it will be somehow resolved, but just postpone it. We are all leftists, or we are all labor workers, and we are all leftists. I mean, it seems really familiar to me. I mean, let's look at the facts. I mean, in Turkey, the most disenfranchised group is women, and just by looking at the raw figures.
I agree with you in the reality of patriarchy in Turkey, but also I have to give to my professor here that in some cases when patriarchy, the discourse of patriarchy doesn't have gender, because in some cases Kemalist women are taught as men in some discussions. So for not allowing scarf in academia within parliament, so it's another problem.
We know that.
Yeah.
But that is not the immediate problem. Is not that the immediate problem is that AKP is in power, and it should not be headscarf blind. Well, anyway. But as you said, then why do you expect this from the AKP? Because we find it sort of an actor that should do it because it's religious, because it's got more sympathy. But that's wrong, as Professor Somer said. I think connecting or depending on one actor to bring change in your life. I think that's
cooperation.
wrong.
The question is when cooperation comes.
Right.
And,
right.
I mean,
exactly. There is that too. There is that too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it would be ideal if Republican People's Party or whatever secular actor sincerely held up the headscarf question and defended the rights of women with headscarf. Because nobody can accuse them of anti-secularism, although maybe they should.
At the risk of infuriating Nur Serter.
But also at the same time, for example, there's a mutual misunderstanding. For example, do secular women have any problems or legitimate fears in Turkey? So I would be very interested in discussing this in a more conservative circle. And the experience that I have had is that actually there was almost anger. Because no, of course not. They have been very free, and they have been they have prevented us from having our freedoms, and they're okay. They have been favored. But that's also another issue, which is not the case. I think secular women in Turkey also have a lot of legitimate fears. All women in Turkey have very legitimate fears, but as far as secular women, if they don't want to cover their head, or if they want to be more free, they have also really legitimate fears. So why wouldn't, for example, Justice and Development Party maybe uphold these concepts? This is a very idealistic picture, but it is also a question to I think consider, because I mean in Turkey the part of the problem is that really people focus on their own problems, and they are very interested in democracy for their own problems. But it's much more difficult to really accept and imagine others' problems.
Empathy.
Empathy, and sometimes just principle too. I mean, maybe you will not understand the other group because you don't live in that person's body and in that person's shoes. But you can have if you have the right principle, you can apply the principle sincerely, and you will say that, you know what, I don't understand it, and I don't even sympathize with it, but I will see that you know, this person is entitled to it. A secular woman can say that maybe, well, I don't understand why somebody wears a headscarf. You know, given her ideology, maybe this is very difficult to imagine that, right? But she can say, but you know, we are different. But you know, I can understand that people who have a different preference or who have a different lifestyle, or, you know, is entitled to the same rights that I have, which goes the other way around as well, right? I mean, then you can say that, you know, a secular woman will have you know, some distant fears as well, but she needs protection too. I think in Turkey we don't realize that the problems are different in different contexts. I think in Boğaziçi University or maybe Koç University, maybe headscarf women they need more protection. I think that's because they are the minority. But you go to Erzurum, it might be the other way around. Then women who are not covered or who are not conservative are in the minority. So the principle should be that, look, you know, we all find ourselves in the minority in different contexts, right? And we have different identities, gender, ideology, income, this and that. So whenever somebody actually finds itself in the minority, let's provide some protection for the rights and freedoms. So, and this principle can be applied, you know, maybe perfectly, but that could be a basis. I think it's a much better basis for cooperation than the identity of one actor versus the other.
That's what the Constitution is for.
Yeah. It's a highlighted Constitution. It is 10 to 7. Professor Somer has been here since 4:30. You also have been here. I think we have had a wonderful, fruitful discussion, following a very thoughtful and provocative talk. We are exhausted. I mean, he's exhausted right now, but I think we all enjoyed it, right? And yeah, we'll probably see you again, or we'll meet again with a different speaker. Thank you. Let's thank Professor Somer.
Thank you for all the provocative and good questions. The discussion we enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was enjoyable, wasn't it?
Thank you.